But this is me. For 30 years, I did this for a living. So I see this happen. They took care of Colbert. That was rude. That was inexcusable. The man deserves a great deal of credit. He's in the Hall of Fame 9 times.
For decades, David Letterman sat behind his desk beneath the bright studio lights, trading jokes, silences, and surprises with some of the most famous people in the world. To the audience at home, the conversations often looked easy, funny, and effortlessly controlled. But behind that trademark grin, Letterman was constantly reading the room, sensing tension, ego, nerves, and the unpredictable energy that live television brings. As he looks back on the golden age of his show, he admits that not every guest walked out to polite applause and walked off with friendly small talk. Some interviews were complicated, some were awkward, and some revealed how wildly different private personalities can be from public images. He doesn't label anyone harshly, but he speaks honestly about moments when charm vanished. Tempers flared just below the surface, or a guest arrived guarded and unwilling to play along. These difficult encounters didn't just test his skills as a host. They taught him lessons about fame, vulnerability, and the weight of expectation on both sides of the desk. In this reflection, Letterman looks back not to shame anyone, but to pull back the curtain on what happens when personality, pressure, and live cameras collide. The story isn't about villains. It's about real people in real time, navigating conversation under the unforgiving lens of television history and how those challenging nights shaped the host who became a legend of late-night broadcasting. When David Letterman talks about the early years of his late-night career, he often describes them as both thrilling and chaotic. The show was still finding its identity, and so was he. The studio felt less like a predictable talk program and more like a laboratory where anything could happen. The audience tuned in not just for comedy, but for the possibility that the night might tilt sideways at any moment. Letterman admits that some of the most memorable moments of his career came not from perfectly smooth conversations, but from the interviews that refused to behave. These were the nights when a guest arrived in a mood that no producer could anticipate, when silence felt heavier than laughter, and when even he wondered what direction things were about to go. He explains that the difficulty rarely came from outright hostility. Instead, it came from mismatched expectations. Some guests wanted promotion without conversation. Others wanted conversation without humor. A few arrived defensive, already bracing against questions that had not yet been asked. Letterman learned to sense that energy instantly. He could see it in the way someone sat down, in a tight smile, or in eyes that scanned the desk instead of meeting his. Those were the moments when his job shifted from comedian to navigator, guiding the exchange away from collision, while still keeping it alive for millions watching at home. He recalls how live television amplifies everything. A small pause feels enormous. A brief misunderstanding can echo louder than a punchline. When a guest seemed closed off, the room itself seemed to shrink. He could feel the audience lean forward, curious and uneasy, wondering whether they were about to witness a disaster or a breakthrough. Letterman admits that of what made those difficult interviews so unforgettable was that he didn't know either. There was no script that could save him, only instinct and timing. One pattern he noticed was that fame did not guarantee comfort. Some of the most celebrated figures in entertainment arrived visibly nervous, unsure how to relax into the quick rhythm of the show. Others were naturally private and struggled with the expectation to be instantly charming. He never saw them as bad guests, only as people placed in an unusual environment where the lights are hot, the camera's unblinking, and every word is recorded. He came to understand that difficulty often came from vulnerability rather than arrogance. The audience might laugh, but he could see the human being behind the persona. The interviews that challenged him most were the ones where humor failed to land. Letterman built his identity on a quick, slightly mischievous style, and not everyone shared that sensibility. Sometimes jokes were misunderstood as teasing. Sometimes sincerity met irony head-on and neither moved. He talks about learning over years when to back off and when to lean in, how to soften his tone without losing his voice. Those nights taught him the importance of listening as closely as he spoke. He is honest that he didn't always get it right. There were evenings he went home replaying conversations in his head, wondering if he could have asked a kinder question or found a bridge where instead there was a wall. The difficult interviews humbled him. They reminded him that while television creates a polished illusion, The people on screen are navigating the same insecurities as anyone else. That realization, he says, made him a better host. Looking back now, Letterman doesn't frame these experiences as disasters but as turning points. Each tense exchange pushed him to refine the balance between comedy and compassion. Each awkward pause taught him patience. Each guarded guest reminded him that not everyone wants to reveal themselves under bright lights. The so-called difficult interviews, in his view, were simply human moments caught on national television, unpredictable, imperfect, and deeply real. As David Letterman continues reflecting on the more complicated encounters of his career, he turns to the role of expectations built long before a guest ever walked onto the stage. By the time someone appeared on late-night television, the audience already carried a story about them, crafted by magazines, movies, gossip columns, or carefully curated publicity. Sometimes those stories clashed sharply with the person who sat down in the chair. Letterman remembers moments when a guest known for being larger than life arrived quiet, withdrawn, or visibly tired, and the room seemed confused. The public wanted the persona. The person brought their reality. Navigating that gap became one of the most delicate of his job. He explains that many of his toughest nights didn't involve conflict so much as emotional distance. A guest might answer briefly, smile politely, and yet keep an invisible wall firmly in place. To viewers, it could look cold. To Letterman, it often looked like self-protection. Fame can be isolating, and a talk show desk can feel like an interrogation table if trust hasn't been built. He learned to respect those boundaries while still trying to draw out something genuine, even if it was small. A single true laugh or unguarded sentence felt like a quiet victory. There were also times when the audience arrived with heightened expectations for spontaneous magic. Some pairings, a massive film star, a legendary musician, a controversial figure, were anticipated for days. When the energy didn't explode the way the crowd imagined, disappointment filled the studio like fog. Letterman recalls feeling that weight instantly, realizing he had to hold the room together even when the moment unfolding wasn't the one people thought they were promised. That pressure could make already tense exchanges even more fragile. He talks about learning the difference between difficult and complicated. Difficult guests resisted isolation entirely. Complicated guests brought layered emotions, history, or unspoken tension with them. He found the latter far more interesting. These were the interviews that revealed subtle truths about celebrity, the kind that don't fit neatly into sound bites. Someone might joke on the surface while sadness flickered underneath. Another might project confidence while their hands trembled in their lap. Letterman came to recognize these contradictions as deeply human rather than inconvenient. Another recurring challenge involved generational shifts. Some Golden Age guests came from an era of carefully controlled publicity, where stars rarely strayed from rehearsed answers. Letterman's show, by contrast, celebrated unpredictability and authenticity. When those two philosophies collided, he sometimes found himself in the middle of a cultural transition unfolding in real time. A guest might cling to polished lines while he gently nudged toward spontaneity. The friction wasn't personal. It was the sound of Hollywood evolving. He admits that humor could be both a tool and a trap. His instinct was always to break tension with a joke, yet sometimes humor made a guarded guest retreat further. Over time, he learned to sit in silence without fear, letting moments breathe instead of rushing to fill them. That patience changed the energy of the room. Occasionally, after a pause, someone would share something honest they hadn't planned to say. Those moments reminded him why the job mattered. Looking back, Letterman doesn't categorize any of these guests as villains or heroes. He rejects labels entirely. Instead, he sees each challenging interview as a mirror, reflecting not only the guest but also who he was at that point in his life, younger, less patient, more eager to prove himself, or later, calmer and more reflective. The conversations that once frustrated him now feel like chapters in his own growth. He ends this segment of reflection with a simple observation. Live television is one of the last places where discomfort can't be edited away. That's why people remember those uneasy exchanges years later. They were real. They showed that even under bright lights and applause signs, people are complicated, unsure, and sometimes overwhelmed. And for David Letterman, that truth, far more than the smooth interviews, is what defined the golden age of his late-night journey. In his continued reflections, David Letterman turns to the invisible forces operating behind every interview. timing, circumstance, and what people are carrying with them when they walk onto the stage. He points out that an appearance on television is just a small window into someone's day, yet the audience often treats it as a full portrait of who they are. More than once, a guest sat down after traveling, after receiving difficult news, or in the middle of personal turmoil that no one at home could see. Letterman admits that he didn't always know what someone was going through until long after the show ended. Those realizations changed how he reviewed old moments in his mind. What looked like aloofness might have been exhaustion. What seemed irritable might have been pain. He reflects on how the environment itself could magnify everything. The stage was a place of high stakes. Hundreds in the studio, millions at home, and careers tied to how one half-hour unfolded. That pressure didn't hit everyone the same way. Some guests thrived on it, lighting up with adrenaline. Others shrank under its weight. Letterman realized that his role was host, emotional barometer. He monitored the crowd, the guest, and his own instincts simultaneously, adjusting in real time. When a conversation started to wobble, he could feel it like turbulence in a plane. He jokes that he became an expert at landing bumpy flights with a smile that sometimes hit his own nerves. He also talks about the rare occasions when tension became creative fuel. A guarded guest might unexpectedly turn a corner, loosening up after a surprising question or a moment of shared vulnerability. Those shifts fascinated him. They proved that difficult interviews weren't failures. They were unfinished stories finding their shape on air. One minute everyone felt tight. The next minute laughter rolled through the room and changed everything. Letterman says those reversals reminded him why live television can still feel electric even decades later. But there were nights when the distance never closed. He remembers finishing conversations feeling as though two parallel lines had run side by side without touching. No argument, no outburst, just a sense that the connection never formed. In those moments, he learned not to force intimacy. Not every meeting is meant to be profound, and not every guest wants to be understood beyond their public role. Accepting that truth brought him peace and made him kinder to his younger self, who had once believed every interview had to be perfect. He also acknowledges his own evolution. In his early years, he sometimes pushed harder, using sharp humor as a shield. As time went on, he became more open about his own vulnerabilities. He believes guests sensed that shift. When he was honest about himself, they often relaxed in response. It created a different dynamic, less performance, more conversation. Even so, he never forgot that power dynamics existed. The host controls the room. Difficult interviews taught him to wield that power carefully, aware that a cutting line could live forever while an apology might not make air. Letterman reflects. 2. On the way memory treats these moments. Clips circulate online stripped of the full context. The commercials, the green room chatter, the day that led up to them. People see a few minutes and draw conclusions. He understands why, but he's cautious about it. He knows that what really happened often lived between the lines, in glances, hesitations, or unspoken emotions no camera captured directly. That understanding keeps him from turning any guest into a caricature. Ultimately, what he calls his most difficult Golden Age interviews were less about conflict than complexity. They revealed that fame doesn't erase insecurity and that charm can coexist with discomfort. They showed him that connection is never guaranteed, even between two skilled communicators. Looking back now, he views those nights with a surprising tenderness. They are reminders that the stage where he spent so much of his life was filled not just with laughter and applause, but with the full spectrum of human feeling, awkwardness, fear, pride, shyness, resilience. And in his mind, that is what made the experience worth having at all. In his final reflections on the subject, David Letterman turns to what these difficult interviews ultimately taught him about himself. For years he believed his job was to control the room, to be the sharpest, the quickest, the one who always had the next move ready. But as time went on and he looked back with the distance that age provides, he realized the moments that stayed with him the longest were the ones that refused to be controlled. They reminded him that conversation is a living thing. You can guide it, but you can't script the human beings at the center of it, especially not under the glare of stage lights. He admits that there were times he misunderstood people. He sometimes mistook shyness for arrogance or anxiety for indifference. That recognition is humbling, and he doesn't shy away from saying so. In fact, he credits those realizations with softening him personally. The very interviews that once frustrated him became lessons in empathy. He learned that not everyone has the same comfort with vulnerability and that not everyone wants to reveal themselves publicly, no matter how famous they are. That doesn't make them difficult people. It simply means their boundaries lie in different places. One of the most important lessons he shares is the idea that live television is a snapshot, not a verdict. A single awkward appearance can follow a person for decades, even if it represents only a bad day or an uncomfortable moment. Letterman has come to see how powerful that brief window can be, and with that insight came a deeper sense of responsibility. He grew increasingly aware that a stray remark or misunderstood joke could become of someone's narrative forever. That knowledge changed how he approached his role, teaching him restraint where he once relied more on provocation. He also acknowledges that audiences played a role in shaping these experiences. The crowd arrived with expectations, and sometimes those expectations made it harder for a guest to relax. The room could tilt instantly. A tense laugh, a surprised gasp, a silence hanging a bit too long. Letterman remembers the physical sensation of feeling that shift, like weather changing. He learned to read those signals and adjust his pace or tone, not just to protect himself, but to protect the person sitting across from him. With experience came the realization that the show worked best when it became a space where imperfection was allowed. Looking back across decades of television, Letterman now sees his so-called most difficult interviews as of a much broader portrait of what it means to be human in public. They revealed how fragile confidence can be and how thin the line is between performance and reality. Some guests arrived armored, some arrived wounded, some arrived playful, and some arrived simply tired. All of them, however, were people first. People who had to compress their complicated inner lives into a few minutes on camera while the world watched. He reflects, too, on the fact that audiences are drawn to discomfort because it feels honest. A perfectly smooth interview can be enjoyable, but an awkward one is unforgettable precisely because it exposes real emotion. He doesn't glamorize tension, but he recognizes its power. Those imperfect moments showed viewers that celebrities don't live in a different emotional universe. They fumble sentences, misread humor, and get nervous, just like anyone else. As he concludes his reflections, Letterman expresses gratitude rather than regret. The difficult nights made him sharper, but also kinder. They reminded him to listen as carefully as he spoke, and to appreciate the courage it takes for anyone to sit in that chair, knowing the world is watching. If he could offer advice to his younger self, he says it would be simple. Stay curious, stay patient, and recognize that the most revealing conversations often happen when things don't go according to plan. In the end, what he remembers most is not the discomfort, but the humanity revealed through it. The laughter, the silences, the missteps, and the recoveries form the true texture of his career. Those challenging interviews, once sources of anxiety, have become stories of growth. Reminders that connection is unpredictable, that empathy matters, and that even in the most polished environments, the real magic of conversation lies in its unpredictability.